Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. I like this stage. When I first came here and saw the stage, I knew I had to find a reason to get up on it, so I'm glad to have a reason to do so. So my background, I've been working in technology for about 15 years or so. My background's really multi-user technologies. Back when the internet was young, the cool tech job was working at ISPs, back when dial-up was a thing. And then the internet hit, people quit calling into my BBS, and suddenly the web came around, and guess what? All the cool tech jobs were websites. So since then, I've really been working with high growth companies who are technology web companies. And in that time, I've been focused between web operations and information security. Because back then, back a long time ago, when people used modems and phones to talk to other computers, the cool nerdy thing to do with open source was InfoSec. Snort and Tripwire and a lot of the early tools were open source. Now a lot of security is paperwork, so I could do that too, but it was kind of by accident. That wasn't by design. And really, what I do is help companies scale their teams, and that's a good way to put it simply. And right now, I'm working at Cover My Meds. I'm managing the security program and helping on the tech side too. I had to pick a title, but I still do a bunch of different things. So this presentation is really about how traditional security controls have been around for a long time, and a lot of them were originally built out of finance. So in finance, it's, for example, like somebody writes a check, or issues a check, doesn't sign the check, and that's a separation of duties control. So a lot of controls in technology came from finance, and those tend to slow companies down. In DevOps, automation, a culture of collaboration, really enables automation and building secure software faster. So we're going to talk about that, using automation to build secure and reliable software. Here's a meeting reminder on my computer that took the dialogue. So why are we here? What are we trying to do? We're trying to prevent software from being vulnerable by accident. And the interesting thing about keeping software from being vulnerable, it's not only about security, it's about availability too. Because buggy, broken software, the things that make software secure, helps make software more reliable as well. So we're trying to keep applications up and resilient. And we're trying to keep people honest too. Back to the traditional security controls, a lot of that's built around protecting from employees, protecting from people in the organization. That's not really how I like to look at things. I build teams of amazing people and take care of them, and I trust those folks. I don't want to build a bunch of crazy controls that slow things down and make the best folks not want to work with us, right? So when I think about security and building software, I don't really think about somebody doing something maliciously. But the neat part is, a lot of the things we'll be talking about today help with that stuff too. So banks and insurance companies could benefit from some of the same tactics. So who here knows the horses versus unicorn thing in DevOps culture? Anyone? Wow, I'd expect at least one hand. I think Kyle does over there. Dude, we had a unicorn on stage for 2 days at DevOps Days, Ohio. So the horses thing. Horses are traditional organizations who might just do things the same way we've been doing them for a long time. And the idea of a unicorn is a younger technology company that's innovating using modern practices. So an example of a unicorn would be, I don't know, Netflix or Crosschecks or Cover My Meds, right? Because we're doing things in a modern way at these organizations. Now a horse might be a bank. There's some banks out there doing some cool stuff, right? But a bank or an insurance company or something like that. And what happens when things go wrong with availability or security? And this is true of even the best organizations. And it's a human thing, right? If something breaks and we want to stop it from breaking, we're going to go back to what we know to keep that from happening again, especially if we have our senior management team or our peers in the organization not too happy with us. It's much easier to say, oh, well, we're just going to stop deploying, or we're only going to deploy at 2 a.m. on a Friday night because nobody's using our service then. It sucks for anyone who has to deploy at 2 a.m. on a Friday night, but we'll do it anyway because we don't care about our employees. So doing that isn't a good way to really build a scalable platform, a scalable team, processes, but it's a natural thing to do. In a young organization, a different version of that might be, oh, we have to grow up now. We're 50 people or 100 people or 400 people. There's always some arbitrary number, right? It doesn't matter. It could be 1,000. It's just this number where somebody thinks, oh, we can't be a startup anymore. We can't do things that way. The thing is, the things we do as a young company help us be more effective. Separation of duties is another thing that, and I mentioned that earlier, but a common response where if something breaks, if we're deploying broken code, a response might be, okay, well, let's have somebody else look at the code first, or somebody else deploy that code, because we don't trust the person who built it. How does that make sense, right? But that's often the thought process that goes into that. And then there's release managers, and traditionally, a change control process for deploying software like that. And I'll example a really bad version, and this happened by accident. It took years for this to happen. We built a really lightweight process to address some requirements to change code. We had good intentions. We didn't want it to be a cumbersome process. 7 years later, and probably 100 different people who have had hands on the process since then, and things have been breaking, and there's a new executive team, that lightweight process turned into a stack of papers where there's line by line file names with hashes, and then 2 columns. Guess what those 2 columns were? They were initial blocks, so one was for a test engineer, well, QA person, I should say, and one was for the developer, and they all initialed because they went through the code review process. And we're not done yet, it gets better. On the last page, there's a big signature block, and it has, there are probably 5 or 6 different folks. I don't even remember now, but it was things like product owner and probably like the CEO, right? A developer, a development manager, the infrastructure manager, all these people, and why? So a really simple change turned into, it took a week to get it out because of that cumbersome process. And that's separation of duties right there. And if it's a technology organization, or I'd argue any organization trying to be competitive in today's marketplace, that's not a good way to operate. So the thought behind separation of duties, well, we want software to be secure and available. We don't want people to do anything maliciously, like an office space, that fraction of a penny or whatever. So we have that thing that gets created. Well, now we're releasing once every 6 months, and we have companies that are taking our market share. But they signed off, so it's going to be okay. It's not okay. That's wrong. Often with those big releases, things break anyway. It just feels good. So small, frequent changes are a good way to address that and build more reliable software. And we'll talk about ways to build security into the process to enable those small, frequent changes. The startup doesn't have to grow up. We can still keep on doing things quickly. This is from DevOps Days Ohio, the unicorn I mentioned earlier, firsthand right there. That's Clinton Wolf from OmniTI. You probably can't tell from the photo, but he wasn't super excited to be hugged by the unicorn. But as you can see, unicorns are friendly. Stephanie the unicorn likes hug-ups. I have a couple videos of this presentation now. I should send it to Clinton and give him the opportunity to opt out of this slide. There isn't necessarily a universal solution, right? It's really easy to say, oh, let's do a DevOps transformation or agile transformation. At least that's what a lot of the big companies in our marketplace are. I was talking to one of those big companies recently, and I was going to come and present about DevOps to them. And they're like, you know what? We don't want you to present about DevOps because we're concerned that it might not align to our DevOps transformation strategy. We don't want you to tell our employees in our internal tech conference something that's not exactly our party line. So that's an unusual case. But there's unique solutions for every organization. And I don't ever go into an organization and think, oh, these things, this set of things is going to simply work. It's important to understand the processes that are in place and how the organization is working and find ways to align and enable and improve those processes, as opposed to simply table flipping. Here are some things I found that work pretty well. I need to make a few more slides. This is where we stare at Shia LaBeouf for a while. And really the secret of it all is making security be part of the process. Embed it in every stage. So how do you build software? Rework costs way more. So involve cross-functional folks in the early planning. How are features planned? Is it a story planning session or whatever it happens to be? Have a security person there. Have an operations person there. Have a cross-functional representation of people who can help build a better product from the start. So we can avoid that rework and avoid that extra cost. And that's a good way to justify it too, because it'll cost way more to have to do it again. Let's just have a couple more folks working with it early on. When you're developing, do you pair? Do you have code reviews? What are the documentation pieces in your process? This presentation really isn't about documentation, but even the most automated shops have some stops and checks and balances. Find ways to include security as those parts of your process. And really one of the bigger things and most important things, and this is where the automation comes in, is do you use a continuous integration or a continuous delivery tool? And that's a great tool. CI is awesome, right? As developers, we really appreciate the fact that our testing is automated. As an operations person can appreciate the fact that changes are made the same way consistently. And then as a security person as well, I just gave this presentation to a bunch of security folks yesterday, and I asked how many people knew what CI was. I saw 3 hands. So that's news, right? This is something that's new and not a lot of organizations are doing. There's automated security scanning tools. And this isn't a tool presentation, so I'm not going to list off a bunch of tools. But I tell you what, there's scanning tools for every programming language. Now, if it's .NET or Java, you're probably going to have to pay for it. But there's a lot of open source tools as well. Static analysis tools, dynamic analysis tools. Things to look for include there's frameworks that I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, but looking for the OWASP Top 10. There's scanners out for that. Looking for dependencies on modules that are vulnerable. Modern technology stacks. This has been a challenge for 15 years, and the challenge is having dependency help. Like it was an issue in Perl, CPAN, and all of that. You have all these modules that are dependent on each other, and then the code written is dependent on those specific versions of the modules. So that's not only a maintenance nightmare, it's also a security nightmare. Now we have languages like Ruby, and Node is especially guilty of it, where there's dependency upon dependency, and they embed those specific versions. So it's much easier to ship vulnerable software. And it's not even vulnerable software we write. Someone else on the internet wrote it. And there's tools out there to scan and make sure that it's the latest version, or if they're vulnerable, call out what those vulnerabilities are. And if it's part of the CI tool, well, it's going to go red and break the build. And most effective organizations don't ship code when the build is broken. I hope you don't. If you do, I'd encourage you to reconsider. We can talk about that later. Security frameworks. We don't have, some of the buffer overflows used to be one of the most common security vulnerabilities. SynMail, Apache, DNS bind, all the things, right? Tons of buffer overflows. That was a serious challenge when the internet was young. We solved that. Buffer overflows are so rare now. Cross-site scripting is on the line. And cross-site scripting is one of those things where it's easy. Who knows what cross-site scripting is? All right, cool, so about half of you. Just real quick, it's basically input validation not being effective. So if somebody puts dynamic code, such as JavaScript, in a form, it could potentially end up in a database or just be presented in a view. So it's a client-side vulnerability. And it's easy to be like, oh, client-side vulnerability, it's not as big of a deal. But the thing is, the products we build on the internet, everyone relies on. If our brands, our company's brands, are associated with something that someone takes advantage of and starts a phishing campaign that looks like it comes from our companies, well, shoot, our customers, our users aren't going to care that it's only a cross-site scripting vulnerability. It's an issue on their client, but it's going to make us look bad. Well, security frameworks help. There are frameworks out there that essentially make cross-site scripting virtually non-existent, and some configuration options as well. If we do those things with our code, we don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. And it's effectively automated because we use that library with all the apps we build. And then we can know that at least most of the OWASP top 10 aren't a big deal. Designing applications for automation. That's really important. And it kind of comes back to that rework thing. It's way easier to put in basic logging when an application is young. Coming back and putting a bunch of logging in later is way more work. And logging is so important. It surprises me where I encounter applications to this day where it doesn't necessarily have good logging for identity, who accesses, logs into an app. If we don't know who logs into an app, we're not going to be able to come back and figure out who compromised it if somebody breaks into it or steals an account even. It could be as simple as that. Implementing things like logging enable more resilient and reliable available applications, right? Whatever word you like to choose. In a lot of web ops circles, the word's been resiliency over the past couple years. I really like that word, but available, highly available were good words for that before. Monitoring. Monitoring is so important from a security and availability perspective because they're essentially the same thing. So the way we design and build applications should include those things that enable operations, site reliability engineering, and security to be built in from the start. And the neat thing is, if we automate all these things, we're using CI or other deployment tools and we've automated our deployments, it doesn't turn into release coordinators and only these set of people can deploy to prod. It's much easier to make an argument that developers can deploy to prod, even if you're talking to someone about traditional controls, separation of duties, and stuff like that. Because then you can say, well, everyone deploys to prod, all the engineers do, but they're doing it through this tool. They don't log into production. They're using these automation tools. And these automation tools have a full audit trail end to end. And it helps to know what words to use. Otherwise, a more traditional auditor might not be as welcoming about it from the start. But pretty much any auditor of any background, if they see a full audit trail of a bunch of changes, that's a pretty big go-away flag. And if it's really high risk, have an exception process. It's always good to do that. And it's important not to forget the basics as well. Anyone here have an Apple II? I figured maybe one person might. I still have a Commodore 64 in my basement. Does anyone want it? I need to clean out my basement. 21-inch CRT, anyone want that monitor? It has a Sun logo on it. That's pretty cool, right? And the basics are the OWASP top 10. Even though we have automation, make sure that we're paying attention to things like that. Making sure that we're using cryptography when we store confidential information. And really, it's not the 90s or even the early 2000s anymore. We don't have to worry about how much processing overhead cryptography has. We could just encrypt everything. Shoot, we've been doing that for a while now. And if you're not, question why. Because it's much easier to have something encrypted and make it more difficult for a malicious nation state, because these are real challenges now. And logging is always important, centralized logging, and having the tools to take a large-scale platform and centralize it. And access and identity is so important. Shoot, I realized a month ago that I work with different members of the company. I'll often join a application review or a product review session, and it's more a feedback, a brainstorming session. I forget to mention things like access and identity and unique authentication, because I just assume we're doing that. I mean, it's nothing new having a unique identity for every user and then logging it. That's something we've been doing ever since login was invented. But sometimes it's easy to build a justification for not doing that because we're stuck in the moment of a problem. Those things are as important as they ever were. It's important to remember the basics. Even if you automate, document the things you do in ways that make sense for you. I'm not suggesting that we create manual processes. The list of basics that were mentioned before, if there's a code review checklist, or if there's an application requirement checklist, have that on there. Why not? Don't necessarily create one if you don't have one, but find ways to make that work within your processes so it's much more difficult to forget those things. And if somebody new joins the organization, if it's somebody's first job, they might not know those things. And that's an opportunity for them to learn just through osmosis, naturally. And consider all the things around your applications too. And that's really where DevOps culture and collaboration comes in. It's just as much collaborating with development and operations and security, all multiple disciplines of experts working together. Because the security folks are going to be thinking about stuff like internal scanning and external scanning. And those are different automation tools that are outside of the SDLC, but they help hold us accountable Because if we accidentally don't use our configuration standard and suddenly an unencrypted website's out there, but we don't know because we always go to HTTPS, something like that will catch it. Web application firewalls are great tools too, where if we find out that we accidentally ended up with a vulnerability in production, tools like that can help mitigate it while we work to get a fix in place. So know that these things don't necessarily eliminate all the things around how we build software. They complement each other. Security Shepherd's a really cool tool as well. We have so many, across different industries, so many manual processes when it comes to things like training. Sure, if we're in HIPAA or banking or finance, certain industries are going to have certain types of training. We might have to have annual privacy training just because it's common in the industry. But that doesn't mean that we have to make engineers suffer through specialized training every year and have it be the same training. There's tools like Security Shepherd that gamify understanding and compromising web application vulnerabilities. It's so cool. It's an OWASP tool. It's open source. Can go download it right now. And it's an application with all sorts of vulnerabilities in it. So the goal is to compromise the application and get the token. And then you get the token and put it in the app, and you get points for it. We have that application installed, and it's not a big official thing, but people play in it. It's fun, and they learn. That's how I learn the best, applying. It's much more fun to do that than read a code block about how to do input validation. There's all sorts of different tools to achieve these things. And they're available for free. OWASP is an amazing project. It's the Open Web Application Project, OWASP.org. And there are all sorts of automated scanning tools, things like Security Shepherd to enable training, and even standards. So if you're looking to learn something new about Elixir, don't quote me on this, Elixir's pretty new, there's likely going to be information specific to Elixir, that language, on OWASP. Somebody came up to me after a presentation asking me about .NET, and I know nothing about .NET, but I go to OWASP and I found the page, and there's all sorts of stuff about building secure .NET software on OWASP. So check out stuff there for specific tools and ways to implement these ideas in the way you build software, and find what works for you. What works for your processes and your organizations and the way you build software. And more importantly, work with each other and folks in different teams in your organization. Because all of us working together is what is going to make a better product, a more reliable and secure platform. Any questions? Tommy.
What point are you guys running these security scans like in your pipeline? Are you doing it on before it goes into your main line? Are you doing it, as you move through environments? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, it really depends what makes sense for you and the way you're using CI in your environment. I don't think there's a right solution there, as long as it's being done and it's part of the build pipeline. I know that doesn't answer the question directly, but I don't think it's necessarily material as long as it's done before the code gets into production. Or if you have tests on the internet, I'd do it before then, right? Because even if it's test on the internet, somebody compromises test, well, that could suck still, right? Kyle.
Just to kind of expand on a little bit, just something I happened to pick up in CodeMesh last week. It is always recommended don't run some of the intensive tests in production in particular, because a lot of them are set up to try and modify your data. So it has to be done in that dev environment. And of course, as part of that, you have to be able to restore your dev environment very quickly as part of that whole process as well. However, of course, it doesn't hurt to do minor things on production, if you can, because
There's good specialized tools to things to help with that. Arbor Networks, really expensive carrier grade denial of service mitigation technology. It's awesome. If you're a large network provider, well, pretty much all of them use it. But if you're a large-scale software as a service company too, there's a certain point where there's a decent business justification to have stuff like that. Why it comes to mind is it has intelligence around throttling and the ways people are manipulating and interacting with forms on a website. So if it sees a bunch of stuff suddenly spike, it'll take action. It has some layer 7 features as well. I wouldn't consider it a web application firewall, but it's pretty sophisticated tech. Other questions? Thoughts? Sir?
What about for the developers? Are there static tools? I mean, like the way you described it has that whole system there, but are there, unit test tools that are useful? Things, coding practice tools, things like Lint. I mean, are there security versions of those to check?
There are. There's security frameworks as well as static code analysis and dynamic code analysis as well. Vericode's a really common commercial solution.
Wouldn't you want your developers to just do that while they're developing?
Well, it's a check and balance thing, right? The same argument could be used as, write bug-free code and don't test, right? Because don't make mistakes. Sir?
Yeah, well, I was going to say that if, I don't want to take too much, but if you said it's not a tools talk, but maybe you could mention some tools in this space, which it seems like some questions are starting to get around. Or just in general, like security tools, some of your scanning tools that you've liked, things like that.
Skipfish is one. It's kind of dated. People have different success. It's a tool that Google open source. Brakeman's pretty cool in the Ruby space. Do you have any you use, Kyle? Anyone else have any tools? On dynamic scanning, more vulnerability scanning, there's stuff like Qualys, Nessus, but I consider that outside of the SDLC, but also scanning tools. Anyone else want to add to that list? Yeah, OpenVAS is the open source fork when Nessus is closed source. Like all these security tools, closed source because people are throwing money at them. So. Yeah, and there's open source solutions as well, but for organizations that are .NET or Java or compiled software, Vericode's more successful at that than a lot of other solutions. So it really depends on the environment, right? But with dynamic languages, post-processed, well, it's not even very effective for that. I had a salesperson say, we can't do that. We don't want to talk to you anymore when we were trying to do a demo. So it doesn't do that. A salesperson tried to quit selling it. But there are tools listed on OWASP.org. And one of the things I like to do too is the lists of or comparison of on Wikipedia. So for example, Google comparison of configuration management software. There's a lot. There's way more than Chef, Puppet, Salt, and Ansible, CF Engine, right? CF Engine was one of the first. It's like 20 years old now. Other questions? Well, cool. Thanks so much for having me, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Just a few things before we end. If you have any feedback for the presentation, I welcome it. Feel free to email me or we can chat later. Script Scribes are open source. Well, not open source, but it's our tech blog at Cover My Meds. We open source software there. Things we built that don't tie to our applications. We talk about things we're building there. Talk about places and events we're presenting and participating in. I organize Ohio Linux Fest. I organize DevOps Days Ohio with Kyle and several others over there. In Laps of Columbus, we meet monthly. Next meeting is next Thursday. And I have stickers for all these things. So if you want some stickers or a button for DevOps Days Ohio, hit me up and I'll hook you up. Thanks so much, everyone. Any